The schoolhouse bell clanged its final dismissal on a scorching afternoon in August 1882, and Georgia Ashford watched from the dusty window as Miss Eleanor Pritchard, the town's sharp-tongued schoolteacher, pointed directly at her while speaking to the school board members gathered outside. Georgia could not hear the words through the thick glass, but she recognized the expression on the teacher's pinched face well enough after 3 months of attempting to learn her letters and numbers in that cramped classroom. She's simple-minded," Miss Pritchard announced loudly enough that her voice carried through the open door, making certain everyone within earshot understood her professional assessment. "I've taught children for 15 years across 3 territories, gentlemen, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that girl hasn't the mental capacity to learn even the most basic arithmetic or reading. She's 19 years old and cannot write her own name without guidance. It's a waste of valuable classroom space and my time when I have 30 other students who actually possess the ability to learn." Georgia felt the familiar burning sensation behind her eyes, but refused to let the tears fall. She had heard variations of this judgment her entire life, spoken in whispers by neighbors in Utica and shouted by frustrated tutors her late mother had hired before the fever took her 2 years ago. The words changed slightly depending on who spoke them, but the meaning remained constant: slow, dim-witted, simple, not quite right in the head. Her father, a horse trader who spent more time drunk than sober these days, had eventually stopped arguing with such assessments and simply kept her home to cook and clean, accepting that his only daughter would never make a proper match or contribute anything beyond household labor. She gathered her slate and the worn primer she could barely decipher, keeping her head down as she walked past the cluster of men in dark suits who nodded solemnly at Miss Pritchard's declaration. The teacher's words followed her down the schoolhouse steps like gnats she could not swat away. Simple-minded. The label felt like a brand burned into her skin, marking her as defective, lesser, unworthy of patience or hope. The walk home took her past the general store where Mr. Henderson was unloading crates, past the blacksmith's forge where sparks flew and metal rang against metal, past the saloon where her father would likely be found come evening. Utica, Montana was not a large town, barely 300 souls clustered along the banks of Willow Creek, sustained by ranching, mining, and the hope that the railroad might someday extend this far north. Everyone knew everyone else's business, and by tomorrow morning the entire population would know that Georgia Ashford had been formally dismissed from school as unteachable. She reached the small wooden house at the edge of town where she lived with her father, set back from the main road with a struggling vegetable garden and a chicken coop that needed repairs. The interior was dim and stifling, the summer heat trapped inside the walls. She set her school materials on the table and began the familiar routine of starting supper, knowing her father would expect food ready when he stumbled home. Her hands moved through the tasks without conscious thought. Fetch water from the pump, build up the fire in the stove, peel potatoes and carrots, cut salt pork into strips. Her mind might struggle with letters and numbers, but her body knew these movements perfectly, had performed them thousands of times. There was a rhythm to cooking, a logic her brain understood in ways it could not grasp the abstract symbols Miss Pritchard insisted were simple. "You're overthinking it," the teacher had said more than once, her voice dripping with exasperation. "A child of 6 can master this. Why can't you?" Georgia had no answer. The letters seemed to dance and rearrange themselves whenever she looked at them too long. Numbers refused to stay in proper order in her head. She could count physical objects perfectly well, could measure ingredients, and calculate how much fabric she needed for a dress. But the moment those quantities became written symbols on a slate, they transformed into meaningless scratches that made her head ache. The door banged open near sunset, and her father entered with the unsteady gait that meant he had been drinking since noon. Thomas Ashford had once been a handsome man, but whiskey and grief had carved deep lines into his face and yellowed his eyes. He looked at the table where supper steamed in serving bowls and grunted something that might have been approval or acknowledgement. "Heard about the school," he said, dropping into his chair heavily. "Figured that would happen sooner or later. No point in you pretending to be something you're not." Georgia served him without responding. She had learned years ago that her father preferred her silence, interpreting any attempt at conversation as backtalk or excuse-making. "Mrs. Henderson stopped me outside the store," he continued, talking more to his plate than to her. "Said her cousin up in the mountains needs a housekeeper. fellow named Adler, Asher Lannister, lives alone, does trapping and hunting, sells furs and meat to the trading posts. She thinks you might suit for the position since you're not going to find a husband with your limitations." The words struck like physical blows, though Georgia kept her expression neutral. She was accustomed to her father's casual cruelty, the way he assessed her worth in purely practical terms. A housekeeper in the mountains for a man who lived alone. She understood what that might entail, the assumptions people would make. But she also recognized she had few alternatives. Women with her reputation, her supposed deficiencies, did not receive marriage proposals or respectable employment offers. "He's expecting someone to come up in 3 days," her father said, chewing loudly. "I'll take you up there myself. Mrs. Henderson says he pays fair and doesn't drink. More than you'd get staying here, taking up space and eating food I have to pay for." That night, Georgia lay in her narrow bed and tried not to think about what the future held. She had never ventured far into the mountains that ringed Utica, those towering peaks covered in pine forests that seemed to touch the clouds. The thought of leaving the only home she had ever known, heading into that wilderness with a strange man, filled her with a fear that sat cold and heavy in her stomach. But what choice did she have? Her father made it clear she was a burden. The town had decided she was too simple to educate. There were no other prospects, no other paths open to a 19-year-old woman labeled as slow-witted and unmarriageable. At least in the mountains she would be away from the pitying looks and whispered judgments, away from Miss Pritchard's contemptuous dismissal. The 3 days passed in a blur of preparation. Georgia packed her few possessions into a canvas bag, 2 changes of clothing, her mother's hairbrush, a quilt her grandmother had made, the little carved wooden bird her father had given her when she was small, back when he still smiled sometimes. She scrubbed the house thoroughly and left instructions for her father about where she stored the preserves and how often to feed the chickens, though she doubted he would follow through on either task. On the appointed morning, her father hitched their old mare to a wagon, and they set off before dawn, following a rough trail that led up into the foothills. The journey took most of the day, climbing steadily through dense forest where sunlight filtered green through the canopy of pine and aspen. They passed abandoned mining claims and saw deer watching from between the trees, their dark eyes tracking the wagon's progress. Thomas Ashford spoke little during the journey, focused on navigating the increasingly rough terrain. Georgia tried to memorize landmarks, noticing where particular trees had fallen across the path or where streams crossed the trail, some instinct telling her she might need to know this route. The higher they climbed, the cooler the air became, a relief after the valley's oppressive summer heat. They reached a clearing as afternoon shadows lengthened, and Georgia saw a sturdy log cabin set against a rocky slope, with a barn and several outbuildings arranged nearby. Smoke rose from the chimney, and dozens of pelts stretched on frames lined the side of the barn, evidence of successful trapping. A massive brown dog came loping toward the wagon, barking a warning, but its tail wagged in a way that suggested more curiosity than threat. The cabin door opened, and a man emerged who made Georgia's breath catch in her throat. Asher Lannister stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they nearly filled the doorframe. His arms, visible beneath rolled shirt sleeves, showed muscles built from years of hard physical labor in the mountains. Dark hair fell past his collar, tied back with a leather cord, and a full beard covered the lower half of his face. He moved with the easy confidence of someone completely comfortable in his wilderness domain, his gray eyes sharp and assessing as he studied the wagon's occupants. "Thomas," he said, his voice a deep rumble that seemed to resonate in George's chest. "Mrs. Henderson said you'd be coming up today." "Brought my daughter like we arranged," her father replied, already gathering the reins as if eager to leave. "She's a hard worker, knows cooking and cleaning, doesn't talk much, which I figure you'll appreciate." Asher's gaze shifted to Georgia, and she felt herself being evaluated like one of the horses her father traded. She kept her eyes down, her hands folded in her lap, trying to appear as small and unobtrusive as possible. "What's your name?" Asher asked, directing the question to her rather than her father. "Georgia," she answered softly, risking a glance up. His eyes were not unkind, she noted, though they held the wariness of someone unaccustomed to company. "You understand what the work entails? Cooking, cleaning, mending, keeping the place in order? I'm gone sometimes for days at a time checking trap lines. You'd be alone here except for the dog." She nodded. "I can do those things. I'm good at those things. Can you shoot? Use a rifle in case wolves or bears come around? She shook her head and her father interjected, didn't see the point in teaching her. Girl's not quite right in the head, can't read or write or do sums, but she keeps a decent house? Georgia felt her cheeks burn with shame at her father's casual revelation of her deficiencies to this stranger, but Asher's expression did not change. He simply nodded and said, I'll teach her to shoot then. Can't have anyone living up here without knowing how to defend themselves. Her father climbed down and pulled Georgia's bag from the wagon bed, handing it to Asher without ceremony. She eats light, doesn't require much. You need to send word if there's a problem. You can leave a message at Henderson's store. There was no goodbye, no word of encouragement or affection. Thomas Ashford simply climbed back onto the wagon, turned the mare around, and headed back down the trail without a backward glance. Georgia watched him disappear into the trees, feeling the finality of this separation settle over her like a physical weight. Whatever this new life held, there would be no returning to what she had known. Come on inside, Asher said, his tone neutral. I'll show you around. Explain what needs doing. The cabin's interior surprised her with its order and cleanliness. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a cooking area set up nearby. A wooden table and chairs occupied the center of the room, and sleeping quarters were divided by a partial wall that offered some privacy. Shelves held supplies and equipment, everything arranged with military precision. Furs and hides hung from the rafters, curing in the warm air that rose from the fire. I'm not much for mess, Asher explained, noting her surprise. Living alone, a man learns to keep things organized or spend half his life looking for what he needs. That space there behind the wall, that's for you. I sleep out here near the fire. There's a lock on the inside of that door if it makes you feel safer. The consideration in his words caught her off guard. She had expected roughness, perhaps even cruelty, but this mountain man seemed determined to establish proper boundaries and ensure her comfort. I don't tolerate drinking or laziness, he continued, but I'm fair. You do the work agreed upon, and you'll have food, shelter, and wages. $2 a month, which I'll hold for you or give you as you prefer. Mrs. Henderson vouched for your character, said you were a good girl who'd been dealt a poor hand. That's good enough for me. Thank you, Georgia managed, her voice barely above a whisper. I'll work hard, I promise I will. He studied her for a long moment, then said something that made her lift her eyes to meet his. Your father said you can't read or write or do sums. That trouble you? She hesitated, unsure how to answer. Finally, she said, the school teacher in town said I was simple-minded, said I was too slow to learn like normal people. I try, but the letters and numbers don't make sense to me no matter how hard I look at them. Asher made a non-committal sound in his throat. I've known plenty of so-called educated folks who couldn't find their way out of the woods if you gave them a map and a compass. And I've known people who never learned their letters but could track a wounded elk through a thunderstorm or predict weather 3 days out by watching the sky. Intelligence comes in different forms. You strike me as someone who pays attention, who notices things. That's worth more up here than being able to read fancy books. His words created a small warm spot in Georgia's chest, unfamiliar and fragile. No one had ever suggested her difficulties with reading and writing might not define her entire worth as a human being. Get yourself settled, Asher said, gesturing toward the sleeping area he had designated as hers. There's stew from yesterday that needs eating. We'll start fresh tomorrow and I'll show you the routine. That first evening passed in strange quietness. Georgia ate the stew, which was surprisingly good, thick with venison and vegetables. Asher sat across from her, carving a piece of wood with a knife that moved in sure, precise strokes. The dog, whose name she learned was Bear, sprawled near the fire, occasionally lifting his massive head to look at her with what seemed like cautious approval. You're probably wondering why I live up here alone, Asher said suddenly, his eyes still on his carving. Most people do. Georgia had been wondering, but she had not planned to ask. She waited, sensing he would explain if he wanted to. Spent 5 years in the army fighting Indians and outlaws and whoever the government decided needed fighting. Saw things that sit heavy on a man's soul. When my time was up, I didn't want to be around crowds anymore. Didn't want to hear gunfire or shouting or any of the noise that comes with towns. Found this place 7 years ago, built the cabin, and decided this was where I'd stay. I go down to the trading posts 4 times a year to sell furs and buy supplies, and that's about all the civilization I need." "Do you get lonely?" Georgia asked, then immediately regretted the question, worried it was too personal. But Ashford did not seem offended. "Sometimes," he admitted. "Figured having someone here to help with the work and provide a bit of company might ease that some, long as we're both clear on the arrangement being professional and proper." "I understand," she assured him, though privately she wondered what proper meant in a situation where an unmarried man and woman shared a cabin miles from anyone else. The days that followed established a rhythm that Georgia found comforting in its predictability. She rose before dawn to build up the fire and start breakfast. Asher ate quickly and headed out to check his trap lines, sometimes returning by midday, sometimes not appearing until after dark. She cleaned and cooked and mended, keeping the cabin in order with the same competence she had maintained her father's house. But there were differences, significant ones that took her by surprise. Asher actually spoke to her, asking her opinions about meals and commenting on the weather and explaining what he had seen on the mountain. He thanked her when she completed tasks, acknowledged her work in ways her father never had. He showed her where he kept his supplies and told her to use whatever she needed without asking permission first. After the first week, he began teaching her to shoot, starting with an old rifle that kicked less than his heavier weapons. He stood behind her, adjusting her stance and aim, his hands impersonal but steady on her shoulders. "Don't close your eyes when you pull the trigger," he instructed. "Keep both eyes open, breathe out slow, then squeeze." She missed the target completely the first dozen times, the rifle feeling awkward and unwieldy in her hands. But Asher showed infinite patience, correcting her position and encouraging her to try again. By the end of the second week, she could hit a tree trunk at 20 paces more often than not. "You're learning," he said with something that might have been approval in his voice. "You pay attention to instruction and apply it. That's intelligence, Georgia, no matter what some town teacher told you." His words, so casually spoken, made her throat tight with unexpected emotion. All her life, she'd been told about her limitations, her deficiencies, the things she could not do or understand. Asher Lannister seemed entirely unconcerned with those supposed failings, focused instead on teaching her practical skills she actually could master. The summer progressed into early fall, bringing cooler temperatures and the first hints of gold among the aspen leaves. Georgia discovered she loved the mountains in ways she had never loved the town. The silence here felt peaceful rather than oppressive, broken by bird calls and wind through the trees instead of judgmental whispers. She learned to identify animal tracks in the soft earth around the cabin and to distinguish between the calls of different birds. She watched how the light changed throughout the day, painting the rocky peaks in shades of amber and rose. Asher noticed her attention to these details. One evening, as they ate supper together, he said, "You see things most people miss. I've watched you studying the trees and rocks like you're reading something important in them." "I like how everything fits together out here," she tried to explain, struggling to put her thoughts into words. "How the birds know where to build nests and the deer know which plants to eat and how the seasons change everything, but it all makes sense somehow. Not like letters and numbers, which just seem random and confusing." "It's pattern recognition," Asher said thoughtfully. "You're good at understanding how systems work, seeing connections between things. That's a different kind of intelligence, but it's no less valuable. Maybe more valuable in some ways." She stared at him, uncertain whether to believe such an assessment. The schoolteacher had said she lacked the ability to recognize patterns, that her mind could not grasp the relationships between concepts. Yet here was Asher, suggesting she excelled at exactly that, just in different contexts. "I'm serious," he continued, apparently reading her doubt. "I've seen you predict rain a day before it comes based on how the animals act. I've watched you figure out which wood burns hottest and how to adjust cooking times based on fire temperature. That takes observation and analysis and practical application of knowledge. Your mind works just fine, Georgia. It just works differently than what schools are set up to teach." Something shifted in Georgia's chest, a loosening of a knot she had carried so long she barely noticed its weight anymore. She had spent 19 years believing she was fundamentally flawed, broken in some essential way that could never be fixed. Asher's matter-of-fact acceptance of how her mind worked, his recognition that different did not mean lesser, opened possibilities she had never dared to consider. The first snow came in mid-October, a light dusting that melted by noon, but signaled the approach of winter. Asher began bringing in extra firewood and checking that all the buildings were properly sealed against coming cold. "Winter up here is serious business," he told Georgia. "We can get snowed in for weeks at a time. I need to know you'll be all right if I'm out on the trap lines and a storm comes up. Can you manage on your own for a few days if you need to?" The question was practical, but it also acknowledged a trust between them that had been building over the past months. Georgia nodded confidently. "I can manage. I know where everything is, and you've taught me what to do." "You've learned well," Asher said, and she glowed under his praise like a flower opening toward the sun. They had settled into a comfortable companionship by then, though Georgia was increasingly aware of the effect Asher's presence had on her. She watched him split wood with powerful, efficient strokes, his muscles flexing beneath his shirt, and felt strange, fluttering sensations in her stomach. She noticed the way firelight caught in his dark hair and made his gray eyes seem to glow. When he accidentally brushed against her in the cabin's confined space, she felt sparks along her skin that had nothing to do with static. She tried to suppress these feelings, knowing they were inappropriate and likely unwelcome. Asher had been clear about their arrangement being professional. He treated her with respect and kindness, but he maintained proper distance, never crossing boundaries or making suggestions that might compromise her reputation. She was his housekeeper, nothing more, and she reminded herself sternly that she should be grateful for even that much consideration. But her heart refused to listen to such reasonable arguments. She found herself watching for his return when he was gone, listening for his footsteps, looking forward to their evening conversations by the fire. She noticed everything about him, how he hummed tunelessly while working, how he always gave Bear the last bite of his supper, how he kept a small journal where he recorded observations about animal movements and weather patterns. One evening in late October, a fierce storm moved through, bringing driving rain and wind that howled around the cabin walls. Asher had returned just before it hit, soaked to the skin from a long day, checking distant trap lines. Georgia heated water and prepared a hot bath for him near the fire, tactfully retreating to her sleeping area to give him privacy. She heard him settle into the water with a groan of relief, heard the sounds of him washing. Then, unexpectedly, he called her name. "Georgia, you still awake?" She emerged from behind the partial wall, keeping her eyes averted. "Yes? Do you need something?" "Just wondering if you'd join me out here. Seems foolish to shout through walls when we could have a conversation like civilized people." She came to sit at the table, carefully not looking toward the bath. The firelight cast dancing shadows, and rain drummed on the roof with hypnotic rhythm. "I've been thinking," Asher said slowly, and something in his tone made George's heart beat faster. "When Mrs. Henderson suggested you come up here, I'll be honest, I wasn't sure it would work out. Figured you'd last maybe a month before deciding mountain life was too hard or too lonely or that I was too rough around the edges for decent company." "I like it here," Georgia said quietly. "I like mountain life. And I like your company." There was a long pause, filled with the storm's noise and the crackle of burning logs. Then Asher said, "I like your company too, more than I expected to, more than I probably should given the situation." Georgia's pulse thundered in her ears. She did not trust herself to speak, afraid she would say too much or misunderstand what he meant. "What I'm trying to say, and making a mess of it," Asher continued, "is that you've become important to me. Not just as someone who keeps the house and cooks meals, but as a person I look forward to seeing every day, as someone I talk to about things I've never told anyone else, as someone whose smile makes this cabin feel like an actual home instead of just a place to sleep." "Asher," she whispered, finally turning to look at him. He was watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch, all his carefully maintained distance suddenly absent from his expression. "I know it's probably not fair to say these things," he went on. "You're here because you needed a position, not because you asked to have some rough mountain man developing feelings for you. But I can't keep pretending I only see you as my housekeeper, Georgia. You're more than that to me. You've been more for weeks now." She found her voice, though it shook slightly. "You're more than my employer to me, too. You're the first person who's ever made me feel like I'm not broken or stupid or worthless. You see me as someone capable and intelligent and worth teaching things to. You've given me more than wages and shelter. You've given me back my own worth in my own eyes." You were always worth something, Asher said fiercely. That teacher, your father, everyone who made you believe otherwise, they were wrong. You have a good heart and a clever mind and more courage than most people I've known. The way you learn, the way you see the world, that's not a deficiency. It's just different. And different can be beautiful. Georgia felt tears spilling down her cheeks, but they were not tears of shame or hurt. They were tears of relief, of recognition, of something blooming in her chest that felt like hope and joy combined. I should probably wait, Asher said, his voice rough with emotion, court you properly, give you time to be sure of your feelings. But Georgia, I need you to know that I've fallen in love with you, completely, irreversibly. And if you could ever feel the same way about a scarred-up former soldier who prefers mountains to civilization, I'd count myself the luckiest man alive. She was moving before she consciously decided to, crossing the small space between them. She knelt beside the bath, heedless of the water soaking into her skirt, and took his face between her hands. I already feel the same way, she said clearly, looking directly into those gray eyes. I've been trying not to, trying to be sensible and remember my place, but I love you, Asher Lannister. I love your kindness and your patience, and the way you make me feel valued and seen. I love living here with you, and I don't ever want to leave. He reached up with wet hands to cup her face, his touch gentle despite his strength. Then don't leave. Stay here as my wife, not my housekeeper. Build this life with me. Let me spend every day proving to you how extraordinary you are. She answered by kissing him, a gesture born of instinct rather than experience. His lips were warm and soft beneath his beard, and the kiss held all the tenderness and passion she had been suppressing for months. He responded in kind, one hand moving to cradle the back of her head, deepening the kiss until Georgia felt dizzy with sensation. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Asher's eyes held a warmth that made her feel cherished in ways she had never imagined possible. "Is that a yes?" he asked, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "That's a yes," she confirmed, laughing through her tears. "Yes to staying, yes to marrying you, yes to everything." He pulled her into an embrace despite the awkwardness of the bath, holding her close while the storm raged outside and the fire burned warm inside their cabin. Georgia felt safe in his arms, protected and valued, and loved in ways that had nothing to do with her ability to read or write or perform abstract calculations. They were married 3 weeks later, traveling down to Utica where the circuit preacher happened to be passing through. Mrs. Henderson served as witness and seemed delighted that her matchmaking had resulted in a love match rather than merely a business arrangement. Georgia wore her mother's best dress, carefully preserved, and Asher bought her a simple gold ring from the general store. Her father did not attend, and Georgia found she did not care. Thomas Ashford had made it clear she was a burden he was glad to be rid of. She had found something better in the mountains with Asher, something real and true that had nothing to do with blood relation and everything to do with genuine affection and respect. The townspeople who saw them together seemed surprised that the rough mountain man and the supposed simple-minded girl made such a handsome couple. But Asher ignored the whispers, and Georgia had stopped caring what people thought. Miss Pritchard happened to be in the general store when they came to purchase supplies, and her expression of shock when she saw them together gave Georgia a fierce satisfaction. "I heard you were keeping house for someone in the mountains," the teacher said, her tone dripping with false sweetness. "I hope you're managing adequately despite your limitations." Asher, who had been loading flour sacks into their wagon, turned with a level stare that made Miss Pritchard take a step back. "My wife manages better than adequately. She runs our household with more skill and intelligence than most people display in supposedly educated professions. Perhaps your teaching methods are the limitation, not her abilities." He took Georgia's hand and led her out of the store, leaving the teacher sputtering behind them. Georgia felt 10 feet tall, defended and championed by the man she loved. "You didn't need to do that," she said as they climbed onto the wagon. "Yes, I did," Asher replied firmly. "That woman hurt you with her ignorance and narrow-mindedness. I won't stand by and let anyone diminish you, Georgia. Not now, not ever." They returned to the mountain as husband and wife, and that winter passed in a happiness Georgia had never dreamed possible. The snows came heavy and deep, sometimes trapping them in the cabin for days at a time. but she did not mind. She had Asher's company, his love, his warm presence beside her through the long, cold nights. He continued teaching her practical skills, how to set snares, how to tan hides, how to preserve meat and identify edible plants. She absorbed these lessons eagerly, her mind grasping concepts when they were presented in hands, on ways rather than through abstract symbols. She taught herself to judge distances and calculate quantities without needing written numbers, developing her own systems that worked with how her brain processed information. Asher began consulting her on decisions about trap placement and timing, recognizing that her observations about animal behavior were often more accurate than his own. She had a gift for predicting where game would move based on subtle signs he sometimes missed. They became true partners, each bringing different strengths to their shared life. "You know what I realized?" Asher said one evening as they lay together under heavy quilts, the fire burning low. "That teacher was right about one thing, though not the way she meant it." Georgia tensed slightly, old wounds still sensitive despite months of healing. "Your heart is smarter than all," he continued, his voice soft in the darkness. "You lead with compassion and intuition and emotional intelligence that goes far beyond what can be measured by reading tests or arithmetic problems. You understand people and animals and the world around you in ways that can't be taught from books. That's a profound kind of wisdom, Georgia, and it's one of the many reasons I love you." She turned to face him, her eyes adjusting to the dim light enough to make out his features. "You've given me a gift I can never fully repay. You've shown me that the way I am is not something to be ashamed of or fixed. You've let me be myself without apology." "The gift goes both ways," Asher assured her, pulling her closer. "You've brought life and warmth to this mountain. You've made me remember what it means to connect with another person, to share thoughts and dreams and daily moments. I was existing before you came. Now I'm actually living." Spring arrived with its usual dramatic transformation, snow melting into rushing streams, wildflowers carpeting meadows in brilliant colors, birds returning to fill the air with song. Georgia discovered she was pregnant in late April, recognizing the signs from having watched animals and listened to women talk in town. She told Asher one morning as they worked together, repairing the chicken coop. He stopped mid-hammer swing, staring at her with an expression of wonder mixed with concern. "Are you certain?" "As certain as I can be without seeing a doctor. All the signs are there." He set down his tools and came to take her hand, studying her face intently. "How do you feel about it?" "Happy," she said honestly. "Excited. A little scared, but mostly happy." "How do you feel?" "The same," he admitted. "I never thought much about having children before I met you. Now the idea of a little one who's part you and part me feels like the most right thing in the world." They made the journey to Utica 2 weeks later, so Georgia could be examined by the doctor, who confirmed what she already knew. The baby would arrive in late December or early January, he estimated. They purchased supplies they would need and made arrangements for Georgia to stay with Mrs. Henderson when her time came, since having a baby in an isolated mountain cabin with no experienced help seemed unwise. The pregnancy progressed normally, though Georgia struggled with morning sickness through the summer months. Asher hovered protectively, insisting she rest more and work less, bringing her ginger tea and cool cloths when the nausea struck. She found his attentiveness endearing, even when it bordered on excessive. "I'm pregnant, not dying," she reminded him gently when he tried to prevent her from lifting a water bucket. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. I can still do most of my normal work." "I know," he said, looking sheepish. "I just want to keep you safe. Both of you." She kissed him softly. "We're safe. I promise to tell you if I need help or feel unwell. But I also need to stay active and useful. It's good for me and the baby." As her belly swelled with their growing child, Georgia found herself reflecting on how completely her life had changed in the span of 18 months. She had gone from being the dismissed, pitied daughter living on the edge of town to being a wife, and soon to be mother, valued and loved for exactly who she was. The label of simple-minded that had defined her for so long seemed increasingly irrelevant in this new context. She still could not read beyond a handful of basic words. Numbers on paper remained meaningless symbols, but she could identify every plant within 5 miles of their cabin and knew which were medicinal, which were edible, which were poisonous. She could predict weather patterns with remarkable accuracy. She could track animals through the forest, process meat and hides with expert efficiency, and manage their household supplies so they never ran short of necessities. Asher had been right. Intelligence came in many forms, and the kind she possessed was perfectly suited to mountain life in ways that book learning could never be. She had found her place, her purpose, her tribe of two that would soon become three. The baby came on a cold January night in 1884, arriving 3 weeks earlier than expected, while Georgia and Asher were still at the cabin. The pains started just after supper, and Georgia recognized immediately that they would not make it down the mountain in time. The snows were deep, the trails treacherous in darkness, and the contractions were coming too close together. "You're going to have to help me," she told Asher, seeing panic flash in his eyes. "There's no time to get to town. This baby is coming tonight." She talked him through what needed to be done, drawing on knowledge accumulated from years of listening to women discuss childbirth and from having helped animals deliver young. Asher followed her instructions precisely, his hands steady despite his fear, his voice calm and encouraging even when she cried out with pain. Their son entered the world just before midnight, small but healthy, with powerful lungs that announced his arrival to the silent mountains. Asher cut the cord with shaking hands and wrapped the baby in clean cloths, his face wet with tears as he placed the child in George's arms. "He's perfect," Asher whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. "You're perfect. I've never seen anything so incredible in my life." Georgia looked down at her son, at his tiny fingers and the dark hair plastered to his small head, and felt a love so intense it was almost frightening. This child would grow up knowing he was wanted and valued. He would never hear words like simple-minded or stupid or worthless. She would make certain of that. They named him Aaron after Asher's grandfather, and he became the center of their world. Asher proved to be a devoted father, patient and gentle with the baby in ways that contrasted beautifully with his rough exterior. Georgia watched him hold their son in his powerful arms, singing off-key lullabies and making silly faces to coax out smiles, and fell even more deeply in love with her husband. When Aaron was 3 months old, they made the trip down to Utica so people could meet the new addition. Mrs. Henderson cooed over the baby and insisted on giving them clothes and blankets her own grandchildren had outgrown. The townspeople who saw them seemed surprised that the mountain man and his supposedly simple-minded wife had produced such a healthy, alert child. Miss Pritchard was in the schoolyard when they passed, supervising afternoon recess. She looked at Georgia with her baby, at Asher walking protectively beside them, and her expression became pinched with disapproval. I hope you're not planning to repeat the mistakes of the past," the teacher called out. "That child will need proper education when the time comes, not whatever irregular methods you might employ." Georgia felt Asher tense beside her, but she spoke before he could respond. "My son will be educated in the ways that matter. He'll learn to be kind and observant and true to himself. He'll learn that there are many different types of intelligence, and that a person's worth is not determined by their ability to memorize facts or recite lessons. He'll learn that the judgments of narrow-minded people say more about them than about the people they judge." She met Miss Pritchard's eyes steadily, without flinching or looking away. The teacher seemed taken aback by this articulate response from someone she had labeled as mentally deficient. "Great, wow." "Furthermore," Georgia continued, gaining confidence, "my husband has taught me that the way my mind works is not a flaw or a limitation. I process information differently than you do, Miss Pritchard, but that does not make me simple or stupid. It makes me different, and different can be beautiful, valuable, and perfectly suited to the life I've chosen. Perhaps if you could understand that basic concept, you would be a better teacher to all your students, not just the ones who learn in conventional ways." Asher squeezed her hand, his pride in her evident. Miss Pritchard opened and closed her mouth several times, apparently unable to formulate a response. Finally, she simply turned and walked back into the schoolhouse, her spine rigid with offense. "That was magnificent," Asher said as they continued down the street. "I've never heard you speak so forcefully." "I realized I'm not defending just myself anymore," Georgia explained. "I'm defending my son's future and my husband's judgment and every other person who's been dismissed because they don't fit someone else's narrow definition of normal." That makes me braver than I used to be." They stopped at the general store to purchase supplies, and Georgia noticed people watching them differently than they had before. There was less pity in their expressions, more curiosity, and perhaps a touch of respect. The simple-minded girl had become a capable wife and mother, and that transformation seemed to have adjusted how the town viewed her. Or perhaps, Georgia reflected, she simply cared less about their opinions now. She had found people who valued her for who she was. She had built a life that suited her strengths. The judgments of those who had dismissed her held no power anymore. That night, back in their cabin with Aaron sleeping peacefully in the cradle Asher had carved, Georgia sat by the fire and thought about the unlikely journey that had brought her here. The schoolteacher's dismissal, painful as it had set events in motion that led to meeting Asher. The label of simple-minded had driven her from town into the mountains, where she discovered abilities and strengths she never knew she possessed. "What are you thinking about?" Asher asked, settling beside her with an arm around her shoulders. "How strange life is," she said softly. "How the things that seem like disasters sometimes turn out to be blessings in disguise. If Miss Pritchard hadn't dismissed me from school, if my father hadn't sent me up here, I never would have met you. I never would have learned that my way of being in the world is valuable and worthwhile. I would have spent my whole life believing I was broken." "You were never broken," Asher said firmly. "Everyone else was just too limited in their thinking to see your worth." She turned to kiss him, pouring gratitude and love into the gesture. "You saved me in more ways than I can count. You saw past the labels and judgments to who I really am. You gave me a home and a family and a sense of belonging. You taught me that intelligence and worth come in many forms." "You saved me too," he reminded her. "I was hiding up here, avoiding the world, convinced I was better off alone. You brought light and warmth and purpose to my life. You made me want to be part of the world again, even if that world is just our small family in these mountains." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the fire burn and listening to their son's soft breathing. Outside, wind whispered through the pines, and snow began to fall again, adding to the deep drifts that surrounded their cabin. Inside, they were warm and safe and complete. The years that followed brought the normal rhythms of life. Seasons changing, children growing, challenges overcome. Aaron was joined by two more sons, Adam and Andrew, born in 1886 and 1888. Then, finally a daughter, Grace, arrived in 1890, completing their family. Georgia's predictions that she would be capable of raising children proved accurate. She was a patient, observant mother who understood each child's unique personality and learning style. Aaron inherited his mother's way of processing information, learning best through hands-on experience rather than books. Asher taught him to trap and hunt and track, while Georgia showed him plants and weather signs and animal behavior. The boy flourished under his parents' patient instruction, never hearing words that suggested his different learning style was deficient. Adam and Andrew learned more conventionally, picking up reading and arithmetic with relative ease when Asher began teaching them from books he purchased in town. Georgia watched her husband work with the boys and marveled at his patience, his ability to explain concepts multiple ways until they made sense. "Where did you learn to teach like that?" she asked one evening after the children were asleep. "From watching what didn't work with you," Asher admitted. "I figured if someone as intelligent as you struggled with traditional teaching methods, then maybe the methods were the problem, not the students. So I studied different approaches, tried to understand how people learn in various ways. Turns out most people grasp things better when you give them multiple paths to understanding rather than insisting there's only one right way." Grace proved to be a perfect blend of her parents, intuitive and observant like her mother, but also able to work comfortably with written symbols. She followed Georgia everywhere, asking endless questions about plants and animals and how things worked. She also listened raptly when Asher read aloud in the evenings, following along as his finger traced the words. The family made quarterly trips to Utica for supplies and to maintain some connection with the broader world. The townspeople gradually adjusted to the idea of the mountain family, especially as Asher's reputation for quality furs and Georgia's medicinal preparations gained respect. Mrs. Henderson remained their staunch ally, always eager to hear news of the children and their mountain life. Miss Pritchard retired from teaching in 1891, replaced by a younger woman who Georgia heard was more patient and innovative in her methods. The old teacher moved to live with relatives in Helena, and Georgia felt a sense of closure when she learned the news. That chapter of her life, with its pain and humiliation, was truly finished. One autumn afternoon in 1893, when Georgia was 30 years old, she and Asher took a rare day away from the children, leaving them with Mrs. Henderson while they hiked to a high meadow Asher wanted to show her. The aspen trees blazed gold against the deep blue sky, and the air carried the crisp promise of coming winter. They sat on a sun-warmed boulder overlooking a vista of mountains stretching to the horizon, and Asher pulled Georgia close against his side. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "The life you might have had if you'd stayed in town, if things had been different?" She considered the question seriously, looking out at the wild beauty surrounding them. Not for a single moment. That life would have been smaller, narrower, defined by other people's limitations. This life, the one we've built together, is exactly what I was meant for. I have purpose and love and a family that accepts me completely. What more could anyone want? "I think about that day your father brought you up here," Asher mused. "How uncertain and scared you looked. How much courage it took for you to step into that unknown future. I'm grateful every day that you took that risk. I'm grateful you saw something worth knowing in a girl everyone else had given up on. You looked past the labels and found the person underneath. That's a rare gift, Asher." He turned to face her fully, his gray eyes serious. "I need you to understand something. Georgia. You are one of the most intelligent, capable, remarkable people I've ever known. The way your mind works, the way you understand the world, it's not a limitation or a deficiency. It's a different form of brilliance. Our children are growing up understanding that because they see it demonstrated every day in you. That's a legacy more valuable than gold or land or any material wealth we could leave them." Tears pricked George's eyes, but they were happy tears. Gratitude for a life beyond anything she had imagined possible. "I love you more than I can express in words. You've given me everything that matters." "The feeling is entirely mutual," he assured her, kissing her with the passion and tenderness that had only deepened over their years together. They made their way back down the mountain as afternoon shadows lengthened, comfortable in the silence between them. The cabin came into view, smoke rising from the chimney, and Georgia felt the familiar sense of homecoming that never grew old. This place, these mountains, this man beside her, the children waiting for their return, this was her world. And it was everything. The children grew and thrived, each finding their own path in life. Aaron stayed on the mountain, building his own cabin a few miles from his parents and continuing the trapping and hunting traditions his father had taught him. He married a girl from one of the neighboring ranches, a practical woman who adapted to mountain life with the same determination Georgia had shown. Adam and Andrew decided they wanted to see more of the world, heading west to Oregon when they came of age. They wrote letters regularly, which Asher read aloud to Georgia, describing their adventures in logging camps and eventually their establishment of a successful timber business. They married sisters and produced grandchildren. Georgia and Asher traveled to meet, marveling at how far their family had spread. Grace showed an aptitude for healing and medicine, combining her mother's knowledge of plants with book learning from a doctor in Helena who agreed to take her as an apprentice. She eventually returned to practice in Utica, serving the community with skill and compassion that earned widespread respect. She married a schoolteacher, bringing pleasant irony to Georgia's life, and they raised 3 children who called the mountain cabin their favorite place to visit. The years accumulated like snowfall, layer upon layer, building a life of substance and meaning. Asher's hair went gray, then white, and his body moved with less ease than it once had. Georgia's face gained lines and her hands developed the roughness of decades of work. But their love remained constant, deepened by shared experiences and weathered storms and the quiet contentment of 2 people who had found their perfect match. In the spring of 1912, they celebrated 30 years of marriage with their children and grandchildren gathered at the mountain cabin. It required significant organization to fit everyone inside, with children sleeping in makeshift beds and adults crowding around the expanded table. The noise and chaos were delightfully overwhelming after so many years of quiet. Grace proposed a toast at the anniversary dinner, standing with her glass raised. To my parents, who taught us that intelligence comes in many forms, that love sees beyond labels, and that the courage to be yourself is the most valuable gift you can give. Mama, Daddy, you built something beautiful up here, not just in this cabin, but in your lives and in how you raised us. We're all better people because of your example. Everyone echoed the toast, and Georgia felt Asher's hand find hers under the table, squeezing gently. 30 years. 3 decades of partnership and love and mutual respect. It seemed both impossibly long and remarkably short, time having passed in the strange way it did, speeding and slowing unpredictably. After the guests departed and they were alone again, the cabin feeling strangely empty, Asher and Georgia sat on the porch in the warm evening air. Bear had long since passed, replaced by a succession of dogs who guarded and companioned them. The current dog, another massive hound they had simply named Dog because naming them made the eventual loss harder, lay at their feet. That teacher was wrong about so many things, Asher said suddenly, continuing a conversation they had last had years ago, as if no time had passed. But she was accidentally right about one thing, though she would have hated knowing it. "What's that?" Georgia asked, genuinely curious. "She said you were simple-minded, meant it as an insult. But there's wisdom in simplicity, in seeing clearly without all the complications that education sometimes adds. Your heart has always been your greatest intelligence. You lead with compassion and intuition. You understand people and animals and the natural world in ways that can't be taught from books. That's profound wisdom, Georgia. That's the smartest kind of knowing there is." She leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the solidness of him, grateful for every day they'd been given together. "I was so frightened that first day I came up here. I thought I was being sent away because I was worthless, because no one wanted me around. I had no idea I was actually heading toward the best thing that would ever happen to me." "We found each other," Asher said simply. "Two people the world didn't quite know what to do with, who made perfect sense together. That's a rare and precious thing." They sat together as darkness gathered, watching stars emerge one by one in the deepening blue above the mountains. The night sounds of the forest surrounded them, familiar and comforting. The hoot of an owl, the rustle of small creatures in the undergrowth, the whisper of wind through pine needles. Georgia thought about the girl she had been at 19, dismissed and discouraged, believing herself fundamentally broken. She thought about the journey to this mountain, the uncertainty and fear. She thought about Asher's first words to her, his matter-of-fact acceptance of who she was. She thought about learning to shoot, to track, to trust her own observations and intelligence. She thought about falling in love and being loved in return. She thought about her children and grandchildren, the family they had created together. The label of simple-minded that had once defined her now seemed ridiculous in retrospect. She had built a rich, complex, meaningful life. She had raised capable children. She had contributed to her community through her herbal preparations and practical wisdom. She had loved deeply and been deeply loved. What measure of intelligence mattered more than that? "Thank you," she whispered to Asher in the darkness. "For what?" "For seeing me when I was invisible to everyone else. For valuing me when I had been taught I had no value. For loving me into becoming the person I was always meant to be." "You always were that person," he corrected gently. "I just had the good fortune to recognize it. You didn't need to become anything different. You just needed someone to see you clearly." She thought about that, about the difference between becoming and being seen. Perhaps both were true. Perhaps Asher's recognition had allowed her to grow into fuller expression of capabilities that had always existed, but had been suppressed by constant messages of inadequacy. The years continued their steady march, bringing the inevitable changes of aging. Asher's strength gradually diminished, though his mind remained sharp. Georgia developed pain in her joints that made some tasks more difficult. They adapted, helping each other, leaning on their children when necessary, accepting the natural progression of time. In the winter of 1918, Asher caught pneumonia after a day of checking trap lines in bitter cold. Despite George's best efforts with herbs and steam treatments, despite the doctor who made the difficult journey up the mountain, the infection settled deep in his lungs. He died on a clear February morning, holding George's hand, surrounded by his children. "I love you," were his last words, whispered with the last of his strength. "My brilliant, beautiful Georgia, you made my life complete." She held him as he slipped away, her heart breaking even as she understood this was the natural end of a life well lived. He was 71 years old. They had been married 36 years, given each other a lifetime of love and partnership. The grief was profound and overwhelming, a physical pain that made breathing difficult. But Georgia was not alone in it. Her children surrounded her with support and love, taking turns staying at the cabin so she would not have to face the emptiness by herself. Aaron moved back into his childhood home to help his mother with the heavy work, bringing his wife and children to fill the spaces Asher's absence had created. Slowly, gradually, Georgia learned to carry the grief while still engaging with life. She found comfort in familiar routines, in the mountains that had been her home for nearly 4 decades, in her children and grandchildren who embodied the love she and Asher had shared. She understood now, in ways she could not have when she was young, that love did not end with death. It transformed, becoming memory and legacy and the continuation of values passed to the next generation. She lived another 12 years after Asher's passing, remaining in the mountain cabin until the end. Her mind stayed clear, and her observations remained sharp, even as her body grew frail. She taught her grandchildren about plants and animals, passed on stories of their grandfather, and continued to demonstrate through her existence that intelligence came in many forms. Georgia died peacefully in her sleep in November of 1930 at the age of 67. She was buried beside Asher in a small clearing overlooking the vista they had loved, the mountains stretching eternally in all directions. Her children and grandchildren gathered to remember a woman who had overcome dismissal and prejudice to build a life of meaning and purpose, who had demonstrated that the heart's intelligence was indeed the smartest kind of knowing. Grace, now a respected doctor and healer in her own right, spoke at her mother's funeral. "My mother was labeled simple-minded by people who could not see past their own narrow definitions of intelligence, but she possessed wisdom that went far beyond what could be measured by tests or schooling. She understood the natural world with a depth most people never achieve. She raised children who knew they were valued for who they were, not for how well they fit someone's expectations. She loved completely and was completely loved in return. That's a life of profound intelligence, and it is a legacy we should all aspire to." The family maintained the cabin as a gathering place for generations that followed, a reminder of the love story that had begun there. Georgia and Asher's story became family legend, told and retold to children and grandchildren, how a dismissed schoolgirl and a mountain man found each other, how they built a life against the backdrop of wilderness, how they proved that worth was not determined by conventional measures, but by the content of one's character and the love one gave to the world. The mountains stood eternal and unchanging, bearing witness to the thousands of small moments that comprised a marriage. Morning coffee shared in comfortable silence, hands held while walking through the forest, laughter over supper, quiet conversations by firelight, the steady accumulation of days into years into decades. The cabin remained, solid and enduring, shelter against storms both literal and metaphorical, a testament to the life built within its walls. In the end, Georgia Ashford Lannister's story was not about overcoming a disability or proving people wrong, though she had done both. It was about finding a place where her particular gifts were valued, about love that saw clearly past surface judgments, about intelligence that manifested in observation and intuition rather than academic skills. It was about a teacher who dismissed her, and a mountain man who said her heart was smarter than all, and how the mountain man was absolutely right. The Wild West had been unforgiving in many ways, but it had also offered opportunities for those brave enough to step into uncertainty. Georgia had taken that step when she climbed into her father's wagon bound for an unknown future. She had found in those mountains not just a home, but herself, the person she had always been beneath the labels, waiting for someone to look closely enough to see. And Asher had looked. He had seen. He had loved. And in doing so, he had given Georgia the greatest gift possible, the recognition that she was enough, exactly as she was, her heart indeed smarter than all the book learning in the world. Their love story endured in the mountains they had claimed as their own, in the children they had raised, in the example they had set of looking past labels to find the truth of a person's worth. The schoolhouse where Georgia had been dismissed eventually closed, replaced by a larger building with more modern facilities. Miss Pritchard's name was forgotten by all but the oldest residents of Utica. But the story of Georgia and Asher Lannister lived on, told around family dinner tables and campfires, a reminder that the measures of intelligent society imposed were often arbitrary and limiting, and that the heart's wisdom was the truest guide to a life well lived. In the quiet of the mountain clearing where they rested together, the wind whispered through the pines, and wildflowers bloomed each spring, nature's testimony to the enduring power of love that recognized worth where others saw only deficit, that built something beautiful from what the world had dismissed as simple, that proved the heart indeed could be the smartest compass of all.